David Miller stood frozen at the edge of the rooftop bar, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering against the polished marble floor. The music pounded around him, bass vibrating through his chest, but all he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears. Across the crowded party, through the maze of laughing faces and clinking champagne flutes, he saw her, gold dress, dark hair cascading over bare shoulders. That same laugh, the one that used to fill their kitchen on Sunday mornings. Melissa, his wife, the woman he buried 4 years ago. She was holding hands with another man, leaning into him the way she used to lean into David, her head tilted back in pure joy. David's legs moved before his mind could catch up. He pushed through the crowd, his colleague shouting something behind him, but the words were meaningless noise. His heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be real. This wasn't possible. He'd held her cold hand in the hospital. He'd chosen her coffin. He'd stood in the rain as they lowered her into the ground. Melissa, he whispered, the name scraping out of his throat like broken glass. The woman turned slowly, as if she'd heard him across the impossible distance, across the music and laughter and chaos. Their eyes met. For one infinite second, David saw recognition flash across her face. Not surprise. Recognition. As if she'd been waiting for this moment. As if she'd known he would find her. Then her expression changed. Fear. Pure, primal fear flooded her features, and she took a step back, her hand tightening around the arm of the man beside her. David opened his mouth to call out again, but before he could form the words, something impossible happened. She smiled. A faint, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. And then she vanished. Not walked away. Not ducked into the crowd. She simply dissolved into the air, like morning mist burning off in sunlight, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of jasmine, the perfume she'd worn every day of their marriage. The crowd erupted into chaos. People screamed. Someone dropped a tray of glasses. The man who'd been holding Melissa's hand, the man she'd been laughing with moments before, stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, his face drained of all colour. Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the marble floor, his body hitting with a sickening thud, but cut through even the music. Security rushed in. Someone shouted for a doctor. David stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, his mind refusing to process what he'd just witnessed. Around him, people pulled out phones, recording, chattering excitedly about what they'd seen. A ghost, a hologram, mass hallucination. David heard none of it. He stared at the empty space where his dead wife had stood, where she'd vanished into nothing, and felt the foundations of his reality crumbling beneath his feet. What would you do if the person you mourned, the person you buried with your own hands, suddenly appeared alive in someone else's arms? Would you run toward them or away? Let me take you back 4 years to Chicago, where this impossible story really begins. David Miller was 34 then, a successful architect with a growing reputation for designing spaces that somehow felt like home before anyone lived in them. People said he had a gift for understanding what people needed, even when they didn't know themselves. Maybe that's why Melissa fell for him. She was an artist, the kind who saw colors in emotions and painted feelings instead of objects. Where David was measured and careful, Melissa was spontaneous and wild. She'd drag him to midnight street fairs, convince him to dance in the rain, fill their apartment with half-finished canvases and the smell of oil paint. They were opposites in every way that mattered, and that's exactly why they worked. Their friends called them the perfect couple, and for once, the cliché was true.
They'd been married 3 years when it happened. No children yet, but they'd started talking about it, picking out names over wine on Friday nights, debating whether they'd paint the nursery yellow or keep it a surprise.
The accident happened on a Tuesday. Melissa had been driving home from her studio, where she'd been working late on a commission for a gallery downtown. The police said the other driver ran a red light, T-boned her car on the passenger side at 45 miles per hour. Her vehicle spun twice, before slamming into a telephone pole. She died on impact, they told David. No suffering. As if that made it better. As if knowing she hadn't felt pain would somehow fill the hole her absence carved into his chest. David identified her body at the morgue. He made himself look, made himself memorize every detail, because some part of him needed proof that this nightmare was real. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, with just a small cut above her left eyebrow. She could have been sleeping. He touched her hand. It was cold. So cold it seemed to pull the warmth from his own fingers, like her death was contagious. He planned the funeral alone, chose the coffin, a simple oak one because Melissa had always said she wanted to return to the earth naturally. Selected the plot at Graceland Cemetery, under an old maple tree where the light filtered through the leaves in patterns she would have painted. Wrote the eulogy himself, though he barely remembers what he said, his voice breaking on every other word. 200 people came to say goodbye. Her art students, his colleagues, friends from college, strangers whose lives she'd touched in passing. Everyone said the right things. She was so full of life. She's in a better place. Time heals all wounds. David nodded and thanked them, and felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness where his heart used to be. After the funeral, after everyone went back to their normal lives, David visited her grave every month without fail. He'd bring fresh flowers, usually sunflowers because they'd been her favorite, and sit on the grass beside her headstone. Sometimes he'd talk to her, tell her about his projects at work, about how her studio was exactly as she'd left it, because he couldn't bring himself to touch anything. Sometimes he'd just sit in silence, listening to the wind in the maple leaves, feeling close to her in the only way he had left. 3 years passed this way. David functioned. He went to work, took on new projects, even won an award for a community center he designed. But he never moved on, never dated, never even considered it. How could he, when part of him was buried under that maple tree? His colleagues worried. They'd try to set him up on blind dates, drag him to social events, tell him Melissa would want him to be happy. David would smile tightly and change the subject. Then came the Miami trip. A colleague, Marcus, had been invited to a rooftop party thrown by some tech mogul celebrating a business deal. Marcus had practically begged David to come along. Get out of Chicago for a weekend, see the ocean, meet new people, forget about being lonely for just one night. David had almost said no, but something, maybe exhaustion or curiosity, or just the desire to stop feeling like a ghost himself, made him agree. The party was exactly what he'd expected. Expensive, loud, full of people who laughed too hard at jokes that weren't funny, and name-dropped like it was currency. David had stood by the bar, nursing a whiskey he didn't really want, counting down the minutes until he could politely leave. And then he'd seen her, his Melissa, alive, laughing, holding another man's hand. Can you imagine that moment? The moment when everything you believe about reality shatters like glass. When the impossible becomes real right in front of your eyes. The man who collapsed, the one who'd been holding Melissa's hand, was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital. David followed the ambulance, his rental car weaving through Miami traffic, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. He had to know, had to understand. The hospital wouldn't let him see the man at first. Not family, they said. but David waited in the sterile white hallway, waited for 4 hours until a doctor finally came out, looking exhausted and confused. The man's name was Ethan Cross, 36 years old, a real estate developer based in Miami. He'd suffered some kind of massive shock to his system, the doctor explained. His heart rate had spiked dangerously, his blood pressure dropped, and he'd lost consciousness. But all the tests came back normal. No stroke, no heart attack, no physical cause they could identify. It was as if he'd been frightened, literally senseless. When Ethan finally regained consciousness, the first words out of his mouth made every nurse in the room go quiet. He'd whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "That's my wife. That's Melissa Cross. How is she alive?" David's world tilted again. Melissa Cross. Not Melissa Miller. This man, this stranger, claimed the woman who vanished was his wife. David left the hospital in a daze and went straight to his hotel room, where he opened his laptop with trembling hands and typed the name into a search engine. Melissa Cross, Miami. The results loaded and David's stomach dropped. There she was. Wedding photos from 3 years ago. Melissa in a white dress, beaming at the camera, her arm linked with Ethan Cross's. The same woman, the same face, the same smile that used to light up David's entire world. He clicked through image after image, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. There were vacation photos. Melissa on a beach in Turks and Caicos. Melissa at a charity gala. Melissa and Ethan at what looked like a housewarming party. All dated after her death. All impossible. David pulled up the address listed for Ethan Cross's business, a luxury real estate firm in Coral Gables. The residential address was included in a public filing from a property dispute. David wrote it down with shaking hands. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Melissa vanishing into thin air, that sad smile on her lips. At dawn, he got in his car and drove to the address. The house was beautiful. Spanish revival style with terracotta tiles and bougainvillea climbing the walls. The kind of place Melissa would have loved. David sat in his car across the street for 20 minutes, trying to gather the courage to knock on the door. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't face the possibility that she might answer. Instead, he got out and walked around the property, his heart pounding. The backyard was visible through a gap in the fence. He could see a patio with comfortable furniture, a small garden with herbs growing in terracotta pots. And there, hanging on the back wall of the house where the morning sun wouldn't reach it, was a painting. David knew that painting. He'd watched Melissa create it over the course of 3 months, 5 years ago. An abstract piece, all swirling blues and purples that somehow felt both peaceful and chaotic. She'd called it Before the Storm. It had been in her studio the night of the accident. The police had told him it was destroyed in the fire that consumed her car after impact. But there it was, hanging on a stranger's wall, 3,000 miles from where it should have been. David's knees went weak. He grabbed the fence to steady himself, splinters digging into his palm. How? How was this possible? If you're enjoying this story, please do me one favor. Hit the like button right now. It means everything to me. Then drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your support keeps this channel alive, and yes, I'm reading every single comment. David was about to leave when he heard a voice behind him. "You're her first husband, aren't you?" He spun around. An elderly woman stood on the sidewalk, wearing a sun hat and holding a watering can. She must have been 70, with kind eyes that held something like pity. "I'm sorry," David stammered. "I don't understand." The woman gestured toward the house. "Melissa, sweet girl, always so quiet. She told me her first husband died in a car accident years ago." The world spun. David reached out, steadying himself against the fence. "She said I died." The neighbor nodded slowly. "About 3 years ago, when she and Ethan moved in. I remember because I baked them cookies to welcome them to the neighborhood. She was very grateful, but there was something sad about her. I asked if she had family nearby, and that's when she told me. Said her first husband had died tragically, and she was trying to start over with Ethan." David couldn't breathe. The morning sun felt too hot, too bright.
Did you ever notice anything strange about her?" The old woman considered this, her brow furrowing. "Well, now that you mention it, yes. She never went out during the day. I'd only ever see her in the evenings, after sunset. And she kept all the curtains drawn tight. I thought maybe she just valued her privacy, but it did seem odd. And she never came to church with Ethan, even though he invited her every Sunday. Said she couldn't, but never explained why." David thanked the woman and walked back to his car on autopilot. His mind was reeling. Nothing made sense. Melissa was dead. He'd buried her. But she was also alive, married to another man, living in Miami, telling people David was the one who'd died. He drove to Graceland Cemetery, made the drive straight through, 14 hours of highway and truck stops and mounting panic. He had to see the grave, had to prove to himself that this was all some elaborate mistake or breakdown or cosmic joke. He arrived at sunset, the cemetery bathed in golden light. He knew the way by heart, every turn, every landmark. The old maple tree came into view, its leaves rustling in the evening breeze. And there was the headstone. Melissa Ann Miller. Beloved wife, 1989 to 2021. Gone too soon. David approached slowly, his footsteps loud in the quiet cemetery. Something was wrong. The ground around the grave looked disturbed. The grass was torn up in places, and there were drag marks in the dirt as if something heavy had been pulled across it. David dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands, tearing at the earth, dirt caking under his fingernails. He didn't care. He had to know. After a few minutes, his fingers hit something hard. Wood. The coffin. But when he cleared away more dirt, he saw that the lid was open. The coffin was empty. No body, no clothes. Nothing but dark earth and the broken pieces of the pendant he'd placed in her hands at the funeral. A small silver cross she'd worn every day. David's vision blurred. He couldn't tell if it was tears or shock or madness. He'd buried his wife. He'd seen her body. And now her grave was empty, and she was alive in Miami, and nothing made any sense. The world tilted. David fell forward, his head spinning, and the last thing he saw before darkness took him was the broken pendant, glinting in the fading sunlight. When he woke up, a security guard was shaking his shoulder, concern etched on his face. David was lying beside the empty grave, covered in dirt, his hands bleeding. The guard helped him to his feet, asking if he needed an ambulance, if he was okay. David wasn't okay. He would never be okay again. But he nodded and let the guard walk him to his car, and he drove to the nearest motel and sat on the bed in the dark, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. The next morning, David remembered something. Before Melissa died, she'd been seeing someone. Not romantically, but spiritually. A priest named Father Thomas at an old church on the south side. She'd never been particularly religious, but in the weeks before the accident, she had started going to see him, coming home from their meetings looking pale and shaken. David had asked what was wrong, but she'd just smiled that distracted smile and said she was dealing with some things, that she'd tell him when she was ready. She never got the chance. David found the church easily enough, St. Michael's, a stone building that looked like it had stood for 100 years. Father Thomas was older now, his hair completely white, but he remembered Melissa immediately when David showed him a photo. "I wondered if you'd come," the priest said quietly, leading David into a small office lined with books. "After what happened, I prayed you never would, but I'm not surprised." David sat down heavily. "What did she tell you? In those last weeks before she died?" Father Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap. Then he spoke, his voice measured and careful. "Your wife came to me because she was being followed. Not by a person, by something that wore her face." David stared at him. "I don't understand." The priest continued. "She told me that it started about a month before the accident. She'd be walking down the street and catch her reflection in a window. But the reflection wouldn't match her movements exactly. It would lag a second behind, or smile when she wasn't smiling. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Stress, lack of sleep. But then it started happening more frequently. She'd look in mirrors at home and see herself, but wrong somehow. the eyes a shade darker, the smile a bit too wide. And then one night, she told me her reflection spoke to her. David felt cold. Spoke to her. What did it say? Father Thomas's expression was grave. It said, "I want your life." Those were the exact words Melissa told me. Her reflection said it wanted her life, and it was going to take it. She was terrified, David. She came to me because she didn't know who else to turn to. I gave her a pendant, blessed it myself, told her to wear it always. I thought perhaps I could help, could pray the thing away. But I was wrong. David's voice came out as a whisper. The pendant. It was broken at the crash site. The police gave it back to me with her other belongings. The priest nodded slowly. The protection failed. I've lived with that guilt for 4 years. David left the church with his mind spinning. He drove back to his apartment and went straight to Melissa's studio, the room he'd kept locked and untouched since her death. Dust covered everything. Her paints, her brushes, half-finished canvases leaning against the walls. He moved through the space like a ghost, looking for anything that might explain what Father Thomas had told him. And then he saw it. Behind the canvas she'd been working on the day before she died, there was something wedged into the frame. A small notebook. David pulled it free with shaking hands and opened it. The pages were filled with Melissa's handwriting. But it became more frantic as it went on, the letters growing larger and more chaotic. The first entry was dated 6 weeks before her death. It's watching me. In every mirror, every window. I see myself, but it's not me. It knows things I haven't told anyone. It smiles at me, and I feel cold. The entries continued, each one more disturbing than the last. She wrote about waking up to find herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, no memory of getting out of bed. She wrote about dreams where she watched herself living a different life, a life where David was gone and she was free. The final entry was dated 3 days before the accident. David's hands shook as he read it. It wants my life. It told me again tonight. Said it's tired of being just a reflection, just a shadow. It wants to be real, to feel sunlight and taste food and be loved. It showed me what it will do. It will take my place, live my life, love my husband, and I'll be the one trapped behind the glass, watching, unable to scream. If I disappear, if something happens to me, don't trust what comes back. It won't be me anymore. Please, David, if you're reading this, you have to know. Whatever wears my face after I'm gone, it's not your wife. David dropped the notebook. His whole body was shaking. For 4 years, he'd mourned his wife, visited her grave, kept her memory alive. But what if she'd never died? What if something else had taken her place, lived in her body long enough to stage the accident, and then walked away to start a new life? What if the woman he'd seen in Miami wasn't Melissa at all, but the thing that had been haunting her, the reflection that wanted to be real? David booked a flight back to Miami that night. He had to confront her, had to know the truth. The woman, whatever she was, had to give him answers. He landed at dawn and drove straight to the house in Coral Gables. But it was empty, windows dark, middle car in the driveway. He tried the door, locked. He looked through the windows and saw that the furniture was still there, but it had the feeling of a place that hadn't been lived in for days. David checked the hospital, but Ethan Cross had been discharged 2 days ago, against medical advice. The nurse said he'd checked himself out, looking pale and shaken, and driven away alone. David felt his desperation growing. Where were they? Where had Melissa gone? That night, he drove to the beach where the rooftop party had been. He didn't know why, but something pulled him there. The ocean stretched out black and endless under the stars, waves crashing against the shore in steady rhythm. And then he saw her. Melissa,
stood at the water's edge, the waves lapping at her bare feet. She wore a simple white dress that moved in the breeze, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exactly as she had on their wedding day. Beautiful, ethereal, impossible. David approached slowly, his heart hammering. "Melissa," he called out. She turned to face him, and in the moonlight he could see that her eyes were empty. Not sad or angry or afraid, just empty, like looking into a mirror that reflected nothing back. "David," she said softly, "you should have let me go." He stopped a few feet away from her. "Who are you? What are you?" Her lips curved into that sad smile he'd seen on the rooftop. I was her reflection, the part of her that wanted more than she was given. I lived behind the glass my whole existence, watching her live, feeling everything secondhand. Love, joy, pain, but never really experiencing it. Never real. "You killed her," David said, his voice breaking. "You took her life." The thing wearing Melissa's face tilted its head. She was dying already. "The accident was real, David. But when she was trapped in that car, when the flames started, she made a choice. She let me take her place. Let me live the rest of her life, so that something of her would continue. So you wouldn't be alone." David shook his head. "That's a lie. I read her notebook. She was terrified of you." The reflection, or whatever it was, looked away toward the ocean. She was terrified. But in those final moments, she was also merciful. She felt me screaming behind the glass, desperate to exist. And she made a trade. Her body, for her soul. She's at peace now, David. Free from pain, from fear. And I got to feel the sun on my skin, got to taste wine and smell flowers, and feel Ethan's hand in mine. I got to live. David's legs felt weak. And Ethan, what happens to him now? Her expression flickered with something that might have been regret. He saw the truth, saw me disappear, saw that I was never really real. The shock was too much for his heart. He'll die within the week. She said it matter-of-factly, without emotion, and David realized that whatever this thing was, it didn't understand love the way humans did. It had mimicked it, performed it, but never truly felt it. "Why did you come back?" David asked. "Why show yourself to me at the party?" She turned back to him, and for a moment something flickered in those empty eyes. "Because I wanted you to know the truth. Because Melissa, the real Melissa, is still inside me somewhere, and she wanted you to move on, to stop visiting that grave, to stop living like a ghost. This was her way of setting you free." The figure began to flicker, like a television losing signal. Her edges blurred and shimmered in the moonlight. "I can't hold this form much longer. The more people who see the truth, the more I unravel. That's the price of being a reflection. We can pretend to be real, but we can never truly be solid, never truly stay." David watched as Melissa, or the thing that wore her face, began to dissolve. First her hands, turning translucent, then transparent, then gone. Then her arms, her body, until all that remained was her face, floating in the darkness, that sad smile still fixed on her lips. "Goodbye, David," she whispered. "Thank you for loving her. Even when I was pretending to be her, I felt the echo of what that love meant. It was the most real thing I ever experienced." And then she was gone, dissolving into sea mist, leaving David alone on the beach, with the sound of waves and the weight of impossible truth. David stood there for a long time, staring at the space where she'd been. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the broken pendant, the one he'd found in Melissa's empty grave. He looked at it for a long moment, this small piece of silver that was supposed to protect her, that had failed to keep the reflection at bay. He walked to the water's edge, let the waves wash over his shoes, and threw the pendant as far as he could into the ocean. It glinted once in the moonlight, before disappearing beneath the surface. "Goodbye, Melissa," he whispered. "The real you. Wherever you are." He stood there until dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Then he turned and walked back to his car, leaving footprints in the sand that the tide would soon wash away. 2 days later, David received a call from the hospital. Ethan Cross had died peacefully in his sleep. No cause of death could be determined. His heart had simply stopped, as if he'd lost the will to keep beating. David attended the funeral, standing in the back, watching as a handful of people mourned a man they thought they knew. Afterward, he drove to Graceland Cemetery, to Melissa's grave under the maple tree. The groundskeeper had filled in the disturbed earth, replanted the grass. To anyone else, it would look like nothing had ever been wrong. But David knew the truth. The grave had been empty. His wife had been gone long before the accident. He sat down beside the headstone, and for the first time in 4 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of grief. Instead, he felt something lighter. Not quite peace, but acceptance. The woman he'd loved was gone. She'd made a choice in her final moments, a choice he'd never fully understand. But she'd made it, and maybe that had been its own kind of love. David visited one more grave before leaving Chicago. A new headstone had been placed in the cemetery, just a few plots away from Melissa's. Ethan Cross, beloved son and husband, 1989 to 2025. May he find peace. David stood there for a moment, thinking about the man who'd loved a reflection, who'd never known the truth until it was too late. 2 men, both in love with the same ghost, both left behind to pick up the pieces. As David walked back to his car, a breeze picked up, rustling through the maple leaves. And for just a moment, he caught the scent of jasmine on the wind. He didn't turn around, didn't look back, just kept walking. Because some doors, once closed, should stay that way. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. If you were David, could you have accepted the truth? Could you have let go? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a similar story, something unexplainable that happened to you or someone you know, send it to my email. I read every single one, and I might feature your story in a future video. I'll give you a shout out too. Sometimes love doesn't die. It lingers, searching for another life to live. It wears familiar faces and speaks with remembered voices. It makes us believe in impossible things, because the alternative, accepting that they're truly gone, is too painful to bear. But here's what I want you to think about as you go about your day. The people you love, the ones sitting next to you right now, the ones you'll see tonight when you get home. Are you sure you really know them? Are you sure the person looking back at you in the mirror is the same person who went to sleep last night? We take so much for granted. We assume continuity, assume that the world operates by rules we understand. But what if it doesn't? What if there are things living in the spaces between? Things that watch us and want what we have. Things that can slip into our lives when we're not paying attention. David Miller learned that lesson the hard way. He thought he knew the boundaries of reality, thought he understood what was possible and what wasn't. But reality is more flexible than we like to believe. And sometimes, the only thing standing between us and the impossible is the willingness to see the truth, even when it shatters everything we thought we knew. 3 months after that night on the beach, David sold his house in Chicago. He couldn't live there anymore, surrounded by memories of a woman who might never have been real. At least not in the way he thought. He moved to Seattle, took a job with a smaller firm, started fresh. He doesn't visit cemeteries anymore, doesn't keep photos of Melissa on his walls. He's learning to live in the present, to let go of ghosts. But sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, he thinks about what the reflection told him, that Melissa, the real Melissa, had made a choice, that she'd offered up her body so that something desperate and trapped could experience life. And he wonders if that was an act of compassion or surrender, if his wife had been a saint or simply someone too tired to fight anymore. He'll never know. That's the hardest part. Not the loss itself, but the uncertainty. The questions that will never have answers. But maybe that's okay. Maybe some things aren't meant to be understood, only accepted. One afternoon, David was walking through Pike Place Market, surrounded by vendors and tourists and the smell of fresh flowers, when he saw a woman who looked like Melissa from behind. Same hair, same build, same way of holding her shoulders. His heart lurched. For a second he almost called out. But then the woman turned, and it was just a stranger. Someone who didn't look like Melissa at all. David smiled to himself, a sad, knowing smile, and kept walking. Because that's the thing about loss. It doesn't end. You don't get closure or resolution, or a neat ending where everything makes sense. You just learn to carry it. Learn to live with the weight of unanswered questions and impossible memories. Learn that the people we love leave echoes in the world, and sometimes those echoes are all we have left. David Miller buried his wife twice, once in the ground, and once on a beach in Miami when he finally accepted that she was never coming back. And in doing so, he found something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. The understanding that life continues, even after the impossible happens. That we can survive things we never thought we could. That we're stronger than we know. So the next time you look in a mirror, really look. See yourself clearly. And ask yourself, is that really you looking back? Or is it something else? Something that's been watching and learning and waiting for its chance to step through the glass and take your place. Because in this world, in this strange and uncertain reality we all share, anything is possible. Even the things we're most afraid of. Even the things that wear the faces of the people we love. David knows that now. And maybe, after hearing his story, you do too.